My stepfather looked me in the eyes on my 19th birthday and said, "You don't have your mother's blood. You're not part of this family." All to leave me out of the will. I nodded in silence, but what he didn't know was that I had something that would change his destiny. And when he found out, it was he who was left out. The birthday cake in front of me had 19 candles lit, but the light they gave off wasn't enough to illuminate the shadows that had settled in our house since my mother's death. If I had known that that very night my entire identity would be shattered, I would have wished for something more than just a good year as I blew out those candles. My name is Alex. Until 6 months ago, I had what I considered a fairly normal life. A first-year student at the University of Washington, a decent shared apartment, and a family, well, a complicated family, but a family nonetheless. My mother, Claire, married Richard when I was 8 years old. He was never the typical affectionate stepfather from the movies, but he wasn't cruel either. We maintained a cordial, distant, but respectful relationship. He was a successful businessman, the owner of Westlake Properties, a real estate company that had grown exponentially over the past 10 years. He never treated me like his son, but he didn't make me feel like a stranger either. Or so I thought. On February 14th of this year, my mother lost her battle with pancreatic cancer. 6 months of agony that ended on a day that is supposed to celebrate love. Ironically, her death left an irreplaceable void, but it also marked the beginning of a change in Richard that I didn't see coming. The first signs were subtle. He stopped replying to my messages, canceled our monthly meals, and when he came home on weekends, I found that my things had been moved to the guest room. "We're renovating your room," he would say. I never saw any renovations. I also started noticing more of Evan and Melissa, Richard's children from his first marriage. Both older than me, 28 and 26 respectively, we had never been close, but now they seemed to practically live in the family house. Melissa had even moved part of her office into what used to be my study space. On July 17th, my birthday, I received a message from Richard inviting me to a small family celebration. I was surprised, but it gave me hope. Maybe he was processing his grief in his way and now wanted to reconnect. I arrived at 7 p.m. at the house where I had grown up, in Bellevue, with its stunning lake views. The house my mother had decorated with so much love. A house that no longer felt like home. The dinner was tense. Evan and Melissa exchanged looks that I couldn't interpret. Richard's new assistant, a woman named Diane whom he had hired just a month after the funeral, served the food and looked at me with something resembling pity. After dessert, a cake that wasn't my favorite flavor, a detail my mother would never have forgotten, Richard stood up. "Alex, come to my office. I have your birthday present." I followed him, confused but hopeful. Maybe I had misjudged the situation. Maybe this was his way of dealing with the loss. His office had always intimidated me. Dark wood walls, diplomas and awards, photographs with local politicians. He sat behind his imposing desk and gestured for me to sit in front of him. "You turn 19 today. You're an adult now," he began, his voice monotone. "And as an adult, I think you deserve to know the truth." He pulled a folder from one of the drawers and slid it toward me. "Your mother, Claire, wasn't really your mother. She adopted you before she met me." The world stopped. The words floated in the air like tangible objects that I couldn't process. "What? No. That can't be true," I managed to say. "It is," he said, pointing to the folder. "Adoption papers, dated 2 years before Claire and I met. She never wanted to tell you, but now that she's gone, I think you should know." I opened the folder with trembling hands. Sure enough, there was my original birth certificate, with the name of a woman I didn't know as my biological mother. Legal adoption documents signed only by Claire. My whole world crumbled with every line I read. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression impassive. "Because you need to understand how things are now. Claire expressed wishes to include you in her will, but legally, you're not part of this family. You don't have your mother's blood. You don't have my blood. I'm not going to keep up the charade now that she's gone." The words hit me like a physical punch. My entire life, the rare times I had asked about my biological father, my mother had told me he wasn't in the picture, but she never, ever hinted that she wasn't my biological mother. She was my mother, I said, anger starting to replace the shock. Biological or not. Sentimentally, but irrelevant, Richard replied. The fact is, you won't inherit anything I've built for my real family. Evan and Melissa are my legitimate heirs. I've allowed you to keep your college allowance until now, but it will end this semester. It's time for you to find your own way. At that moment, the door cracked open slightly. Evan and Melissa were there, listening. At least Melissa had the decency to look uncomfortable. Evan just stared at me with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Something inside me broke, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I understand, I said, closing the folder. Can I keep this? Richard seemed momentarily surprised by my calm. He nodded. Thanks for dinner, I added, standing up. And for the clarity. I left that office with my head held high, passed by my step-siblings without looking at them, and left that house promising myself that it would be the last time I allowed Richard to make me feel like I didn't belong. In the car, I finally let the tears flow. Not just for the revelation, but for the calculated cruelty of the timing. My birthday. The first birthday without my mother. As if he had been waiting for the moment when I would feel the most vulnerable. As I drove back to my apartment, part of me wanted to accept his version and walk away forever. But another part, a part that suspiciously sounded like my mother's voice, whispered that something wasn't right about this entire situation. My mother wouldn't have kept such a secret without a reason. And Richard wouldn't have waited 6 months after her death to drop this bombshell if there wasn't something else at stake. I arrived at my apartment still in shock, but with growing determination. If Richard wanted a war, he would get one. Because what he didn't know was that my mother had always prepared me to defend what's mine. And something told me there was much more to this story than he was willing to admit. I spent the night of July 17th alternating between episodes of uncontrollable crying and moments of absolute clarity. The folder Richard had handed me lay open on my desk, illuminated by the bluish light of my laptop as I frantically researched everything I could about adoptions in the state of Washington. At 3:42 a.m., when my roommate Mike knocked on the wall separating our rooms, yelling, "For the love of God, just sleep already," I decided I needed a plan. A methodology. Something to hold on to amid the chaos. The first person I contacted was Janet, my mother's best friend. They had always been inseparable from college until the end. If anyone knew Claire's secrets, it was her. "Alex, sweetheart, have you been crying?" was the first thing Janet said when we met at her favorite cafe, Café Ladro in Queen, and 2 days later. She was wearing her signature silk scarf around her neck and sunglasses even indoors. "Your eyes are swollen." I told her everything. The birthday, the revelation, the documents, Richard's threat to cut off my university allowance. Her expression shifted from surprise to anger, and then to something more complex, a mix of sadness and resignation. "Your mother feared this might happen," she finally said, stirring her coffee without looking at it. Richard was always calculating. But this is low, even for him. "So it's true?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Was I adopted?" Janet sighed deeply. "Yes, sweetheart. Claire adopted you when you were just 6 months old. It was a few years before she met Richard. She was single, just starting her financial consulting business, and decided she wanted to be a mother without waiting to find a partner. You were always her choice, Alex. Her priority." I felt tears forming again. Though painful, there was something comforting in confirming that my mother, because that's still who she was to me, had deliberately chosen me. "Why didn't she tell me?" "She wanted to," Janet explained. "But then she met Richard, and let's just say he had very traditional ideas about family. He convinced her to wait. Then, when they got married, he insisted it was better not to confuse you. And over time, I guess it became harder to find the right moment." I took a sip of my now cold Americano, processing. "Richard mentioned she wanted to include me in her will. Do you know anything about that?" Janet tensed visibly. "The only thing I know is that Claire was concerned about how Richard was handling the financial matters in the months before the end. She told me she had to fix some things to protect you. What things? She didn't go into detail. Claire was always private about financial matters, even with me. But Janet hesitated, lowering her voice even more. She mentioned a safety deposit box. She said she gave you the key. My mind instantly traveled to last Christmas. My mother, already very ill, had given me a small package. For when you need it, she had said. Inside was a key and a card with an address and a number. I had kept it in my sock drawer, not thinking much of it, assuming it was some sentimental gift to open later. That same afternoon, I visited the First Seattle Bank downtown. Safety Deposit Box 1147 contained several envelopes, an external hard drive, and a letter addressed to me in my mother's unmistakable handwriting. My dear Alex, it began. If you're reading this, it means I am no longer with you, and things with Richard have not gone the way I had hoped. There are truths you need to know, some painful, some liberating. What followed left me stunned. According to my mother, she had been the financial force behind the success of Westlake Properties. She had provided the initial capital, her connections in the financial world, and the business structure. Richard had mostly been the public face, in charge of public relations and sales, but the strategic and financial decisions had always been hers. We set up the company as a 60-40 partnership in my favor, she wrote. But in recent months, I've noticed suspicious movements. Transfers to accounts I don't recognize, subsidiary companies created without my full knowledge. I fear Richard is laying the groundwork for something I cannot foresee. The envelopes contained financial statements, original contracts, printed emails. The hard drive, protected by a password, my birth date, contained digital copies of everything, along with audio recordings of board meetings where my mother questioned certain moves and Richard gave evasive explanations. But the most shocking was the last document, an updated will, signed and certified just 3 weeks before her death. In it, my mother explicitly bequeathed me her share in Westlake Properties, 60%, the family home we had shared, and several other assets. The document included an additional note. Richard never completed your legal adoption as promised. Despite his frequent promises, he always found excuses to delay it. Now I understand why. However, this does not change anything legally for my will. You are my son in every way that matters, and my legitimate heir. Sitting in my small apartment that night, surrounded by documents scattered across the floor, the pieces began to fall into place. Richard not only wanted to exclude me from the inheritance, he was actively working to take what legitimately belonged to me. What legitimately belonged to both of us, really, because the will also assigned smaller percentages to Evan and Melissa. The following 2 weeks were a whirlwind. I discreetly consulted with an attorney, Marcus Daniels, recommended in my mother's letter. He was an intimidating man, with silver hair and a formidable reputation in financial fraud cases. Your mother was a brilliant woman, he said after reviewing the documents. And prepared. We have enough here to build a strong case, but we need more. With his guidance, I hired a forensic accountant who began to trace the money. The results were even more alarming than I had expected. Richard had been diverting funds to shell companies in Nevada and Wyoming, all related to properties not listed in Westlake's official books. The pattern had begun subtly 3 years ago but had accelerated dramatically since my mother's cancer diagnosis. Typical, the accountant commented, a meticulous man named Warren. They wait for the partner to be vulnerable or distracted. In this case, your mother was fighting for her life. By the end of August, armed with substantial evidence, I decided to confront Richard. A part of me, the innocent part that still believed in the possibility of a peaceful resolution, thought that maybe, faced with the evidence, he would reconsider his position. It was complete naivety. I found him in his office downtown, an impressive space on the 34th floor with views of the Sound. His secretary tried to stop me, but I entered anyway. Alex, he said, barely glancing up from his computer, I don't recall scheduling a meeting. You didn't, I replied, shutting the door behind me. But I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. I told him I knew about the will, about my mother's majority share, about the suspicious transfers. With each revelation, his face became more stone-like, his jaw more tense. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. "Impressive," he finally said. "Claire taught you well. But let me clarify something. You have nothing. A will no one has seen, accusations of embezzlement without context, and the word of an adopted boy against a respected businessman. Do you really think you have a chance?" He stood up, walking toward the window. "Let me give you some advice, Alex. Take the subsidy I've generously offered to finish this semester, graduate, and move on with your life. If you try anything, not only will you lose, but I'll make it very costly for you." "Are you threatening me?" I asked, incredulous. "I'm offering you an easy way out," he replied. "More than you deserve, considering you're not even part of this family." Something broke inside me. It wasn't sadness or fear. It was clarity. This man, who had shared a decade of my life, who had been with my mother in her final moments, felt absolutely nothing for me. To him, I was simply an inconvenience to eliminate. "I'll see you in court," I said, heading for the door. "Alex," he called when I already had my hand on the doorknob. "Do you know I can have Evan and Melissa testify that Claire was mentally unstable at the end? That I'll take every penny of your education? That I'll destroy any career prospects you might have in this city?" I turned to look at him one last time. "My mother always said you showed your true face when you felt cornered. I'm finally seeing it." I walked out of there with trembling legs but my determination intact. That night, I called Marcus Daniels. "I'm ready," I told him. "Let's do it." The judicial system moves slowly. This was the first thing I learned in the following weeks. Marcus had warned me it would be a long process, but the reality exceeded my expectations. "Estate cases are complicated," he explained during one of our many meetings in his Pioneer Square office. "Especially when there are allegations of financial fraud. We need to be meticulous." September turned into October, and the movements began on both sides. Richard presented the previous will, dated 3 years earlier, where my mother left me a modest sum but excluded me from the company. Of course, he hadn't mentioned the existence of this document when he told me I wouldn't receive anything. We presented the updated will, along with preliminary evidence of the suspicious transfers. Judge Gregory Phillips, a man in his 60s with a reputation for unwavering impartiality, ordered a complete forensic audit of Westlake properties and temporarily froze the main assets. Richard countered exactly as he had threatened. Evan and Melissa signed affidavits claiming that my mother had shown signs of confusion and paranoia in her last months. My university allowance was immediately canceled. Even my landlord received a mysterious call suggesting that I could be a problematic tenant. What Richard didn't expect was that I was prepared for all of this. Thanks to my mother's foresight, I had enough funds in a separate account to keep me afloat. And Marcus had anticipated the attack on my mother's mental capacity. "It's a desperate and predictable move," he said, as we prepared our response. "Fortunately, we have this." This was a complete psychological evaluation my mother had undergone 3 weeks before signing the new will, specifically to counter any such accusations. Dr. Harriet Chin, a respected neuropsychologist, had certified that Claire was fully lucid and capable of making complex financial decisions. But our trump card came from an unexpected place. On November 12th, I received a call from an unknown number. It was Melissa. "Alex, I need to see you," she said, her voice tense. "In person. I can't talk on the phone." We met at a small park near the hospital where she worked as an administrator. She was pale, nervous, constantly looking around as if fearing being watched. "What Dad is doing is wrong," she finally blurted out, after several minutes of small talk. "I've known for a while, but I was scared to face him." She told me that she had witnessed a heated argument between my mother and Richard 3 months before her death. Claire accused him directly of diverting funds. He denied it all, of course, but then I heard him talking on the phone with someone, saying he needed to accelerate the plan because she was starting to ask uncomfortable questions. According to Melissa, Richard had manipulated Evan with promises of total control over the company, but she had always suspected things were not as her father presented them. I signed that statement because he pressured me, she confessed, tears welling in her eyes. He said it was best for everyone, that you would be fine with your share. But last night I found this in his office at home. She handed me a USB drive. It contained emails between Richard and his personal lawyer, not the company's, explicitly discussing how to restructure Westlake to minimize Claire's share and ensure the kid doesn't have access to anything substantial. Some of these emails dated back to as far as 2 years ago, when my mother was still perfectly healthy. Why are you giving me this? I asked, genuinely confused. Melissa looked toward the horizon, where the Space Needle's spires stood against the gray sky. Claire was more of a mother to me than my own. She never treated me like the ex's daughter. She supported me when I chose not to pursue medicine as Dad wanted. She quietly paid part of my tuition when he threatened to cut off my funds. She turned to me, her face now determined. And you're my brother, Alex. Maybe not by blood, but Claire raised us both. What Dad is doing, it's not who she would have wanted us to be. That night, Marcus reviewed the contents of the USB drive. This is dynamite, he said, the exhaustion on his face replaced by renewed energy. If Melissa is willing to testify. She is, I confirmed. I had taken her directly to his office after our meeting, where she gave a full statement. Things moved quickly after that. On November 28th, Judge Phillips called a special hearing to review the new evidence. Courtroom 304 in King County Courthouse was almost empty, except for the parties directly involved. Richard and his lawyer, Evan, notably separated from his father, Melissa at my side, Marcus and I, the forensic accountant, and a few court officers. What followed was like a scene from one of those legal shows my mother used to watch, except it was painfully real. Marcus methodically presented the evidence, the updated will, the financial reports showing the irregular transfers, the incriminating emails, and finally, Melissa's testimony. Richard remained impassive for most of the proceedings, but when Melissa began speaking, I saw something I had never seen in his eyes: fear. Ms. Bennett, the judge asked after her testimony, are you aware of the legal implications of your statements? You are accusing your father of deliberate fraud. Yes, Your Honor, Melissa replied, her voice steady despite the tears running down her cheeks. I am. Richard made one last desperate play. He stood up, interrupting the proceedings, and offered a settlement. He would divide the company into 3 equal parts between Evan, Melissa, and me, if we dropped all fraud charges. Judge Phillips, visibly irritated by the interruption, reminded him that he was not in a position to negotiate. Mr. Westlake, based on the evidence presented, it seems you have no authority to dispose of these assets in the first place. The resolution came on December 14th, nearly 5 months after that fateful birthday. The judge ruled entirely in our favor. My mother's updated will was deemed valid and enforceable. The transfers made by Richard after the cancer diagnosis were declared fraudulent and reversed, and a separate criminal investigation was ordered for possible embezzlement. Richard left the room without looking at me, escorted by his lawyer and a visibly furious Evan. Melissa and I remained seated, processing what had happened, until Marcus gently reminded us that we needed to sign some documents. What happens now? I asked as I signed form after form in a small conference room. Now, Marcus said with a tired smile, you get what's yours. It's been 3 months since the court ruling. The transition hasn't been easy. Richard faces criminal charges for financial fraud, and though I feel vindicated, there's no real satisfaction in seeing the fall of someone I once considered family. Westlake Properties now operates under new management. I hired an experienced CEO to oversee daily operations while I finish my studies. Surprisingly, Evan eventually reached out, not with a direct apology, but with a tacit acknowledgement that things had been mishandled. He now works at the company, contributing his experience in sales. Melissa and I have developed a closer relationship. It turns out we have more in common than we ever allowed ourselves to discover, caught up in the dynamic Richard had fostered. She now runs the community relations department, implementing affordable housing programs my mother always wanted to develop. The family home now feels too large and empty, so I decided to sell it. Instead, I established the Claire Bennett Foundation, dedicated to supporting single mothers who wish to adopt. The first beneficiary received her grant on February 14th, exactly 1 year after my mother's death. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I wonder if my mother knew how all this would end. If, when she handed me that key at Christmas, with her, "For when you need it," she had foreseen this outcome. Part of me thinks she did. Claire was always 10 steps ahead of everyone. Last week, while sorting through some of her belongings, I found one more letter, hidden in a secret compartment in her jewelry box. It was dated 1 week before her death, when she could barely hold a pen. My dear Alex, if you're reading this, it means you found your way through the storm. I always knew you would. From the moment I held you in my arms when you were 6 months old, I knew you were special. Not because of your intelligence or kindness, though you have both in abundance, but because of your resilience. Life will give you many blows, sweetheart. Some people will tell you that you don't belong, that you're not enough. Don't believe them. You belong exactly where you decide to belong. I don't know exactly what will happen when I'm gone, but I know Richard. I prepared everything I could to protect you, but in the end, you were the one who had to fight the battle. I hope the victory was sweet, but not bitter. Always remember, family isn't about blood. It's about love, choice, and being present. I chose you. You chose me. That's stronger than any biological bond. With all my love, Mom. I wish I could say I read it with serenity, but the truth is, I cried like I hadn't cried since her funeral. Tears of pain, yes, but also of gratitude and closure. Richard tried to take my place in the family by appealing to blood. What he never understood is that the strongest bonds aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you deliberately forge, day by day, with love and commitment. My mother knew that. And thanks to her, I know it now too. There's no sweeter revenge than living well, honoring the legacy of those who truly loved us. And that's exactly what I plan to do. At the end of the day, what Richard never understood is that real families are built with love and choice, not DNA. He tried to use blood as a weapon, but my mother's planning and the truth were stronger. Sometimes, those who try to leave us out are the ones who end up excluded by their own actions. If this story resonated with you, consider signing up for Story Confessions for more tales of family justice and life lessons learned the hard way. Your feedback means a lot to me. Have you ever had to face someone who tried to exclude you from what rightfully belonged to you? Sometimes, sharing our experiences is the first step toward healing.